Francis Marion, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to the PD Fiction Festival and Poetry Festival. Let's not leave out poetry. Although, actually, I mean, those of you who have been around for a day or two know that it's more than that. It's nonfiction, it's music, it's a little of this, and it's a little of that, which is, I think, exactly the way it should be. And judging from the numerous familiar faces out there, some of you have made time to attend several of the sessions over the last day or two, and I'm pleased about that. To the students among us, let me just say this sort of opportunity offers the kind of opportunity that I think on a college campus we should all value. It's an opportunity to meet writers with international reputations, to ask questions, and to hear their work talked about, and to have them sign books as well. To those of you who are visiting from the community or from other areas, we welcome you and we hope you'll return to campus often. You too are important in our university mission to serve not only the students, but also to open our doors to others as well. Before introducing this evening's guest, let me remind you of some of the other events coming up on the festival schedule. Following the program, there will be a reception over at the cottage across the lawn. Please join us for that. And tomorrow at 9:00 a.m., we start up again with presentations by Dr. Ed Eliezer and Dr. Peter Whelan on choosing a good translation. Following that will be a couple of sessions featuring native South Carolinian Terrence Hayes, a poet now living in Pittsburgh, whom some of us were fortunate enough to hear from today. Then at 1 o'clock tomorrow, our festival concludes with a talk by Sharon McCrum. And those of you who heard her earlier this afternoon know that you won't want to miss that talk as well. So I hope that some of you will return to tomorrow morning's and early afternoon's festivities. Our guest this evening is Naomi Shihab-Nye. She's been such a welcome presence over the past couple of days that some of us, I think, already are thinking of her as a friend and a colleague. Some of you met her in sessions earlier today. Naomi grew up in St. Louis, but has lived in San Antonio much of her life, along with her photographer husband and son, who is now in college in San Antonio. Naomi Shihab-Nye is the author or editor of more than 20 volumes, and the diversity of her work is impressive. Her books of poetry include 19 Varieties of Gazelle, Poems of the Middle East, Fuel, and You and Yours. She published Never in a Hurry, a collection of essays often focusing on her life in San Antonio and on her Middle Eastern family connections. She's written several novels for young readers, as well as picture books. In addition, she's edited a number of poetry collections for young readers, and I won't embarrass her by reciting the numerous awards that her work has brought her. Some of her books will be available, I might say, for sale out in the lobby after the session. Naomi often refers to herself as a wandering poet, and her extensive travel in many countries of the world confirm that label. When she was young, her father, who was Palestinian and a writer himself, took the family to live in Jerusalem for a year. And since then, she's made many trips to the Middle East. As her poetry, fiction, and nonfiction show, she has an abiding interest in that part of the world, its beauty and culture, as well as the past and present turmoil that plagues it. We're fortunate this week to be her travel destination. Please join me in welcoming Naomi Shihab-Nye.
Thank you so much, Ken. It's a privilege, a pleasure, a joy to be with you all, and I thank you for coming out on a Friday night. Ken has been a fantastic host. All the faculty hosts have been so kind to us. It was a great pleasure to appear today up here. I feel at home in this room now, Terrence. This is like our second home with you. Loved everything you said, and we'll be thinking about it for a long time. Welcome, President Carter. It's so nice to have you right here. It's very touching to a poet to have the president of the university come to the reading. That doesn't always happen, and I really appreciate it. I wouldn't mind staying here, actually. You know, all this wandering, this is a very special place, and I have been joking around about it, but really the hospitality here has been a very, very touching experience, and the campus of Francis Marion is just one of the most beautiful campuses I've walked around in a long time, and the students are so kind, so it's been a good time. Thank you for having me here. I loved hearing Tobias Wolff for the first time in my life, too, and just have felt like it's a great thing you're doing here with the Literary Festival. I'd also like to go onto the PD River. I certainly wish I could, seeing that beautiful image that's on the brochure, and know more about the land and rivers around here. I always like to open just with a few quotes or a couple of very short poems by other people, just to kind of get me on the right track. And I just read a beautiful quote by the Professor Colleen Grissom is her name, one of the biggest reading advocates I've ever met in my own life. She was a Trinity University English professor and became dean there, dean of students, and is still teaching English there, even though I graduated long ago. And she gives talks on reading frequently and on her favorite books that she's read recently. And last week she gave one. I was out of town and couldn't hear her, but in the newspaper there was a beautiful article about her lifelong passion for reading and some of the books she was recommending this time around. And she said, growing up in a small town in East Texas, that she said, maybe I turned to books because I was lonely and unhappy, but I have no memory of that. Really, what she remembered was just being drawn to books magnetically, as if she knew there was something there for her. And she says, reading is a solitary process and can teach you the pleasures of aloneness. I recommend solitude for your personal rejuvenation. And she also talks then about the kind of paradox that you read while you're alone, but then one of the greatest pleasures is talking to other people about books that you've loved or read differently or had different thoughts about. So that was just a very nice, I love that reference to solitude, something I think we need to be reminded of sometimes, that it's okay to stay home some afternoons and evenings and read. And then I was very happy to see yesterday in the New York Times that a longtime favorite poet of mine, Anne Stevenson, has won the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Lannan Foundation. And Anne Stevenson was born of American parents. Her father was a philosopher, but she grew up and lived in England most of her life. And I'm just so thrilled that she got this award. And I wanted to read the beginning of her poem, In the Tunnel of Summers. I realize it's autumn now, but to me this has always been kind of a magical movement into language, the opening of this poem. Moving from day into day, I don't know how, eating these plums now, this morning for breakfast, tasting of childhood's mouth pucker tartness, watching the broad light, seed in the fences, honey of barley, gold ocean, grasses, as the tunnel of summers, of nothing but summers, opens again in my traveling senses. I am 8 and 18 and 80, all the Augusts of my day. Why should I be more than another? And then she goes on, but I urge you to read Anne Stevenson if you haven't read her. I found her not as widely read in the United States as I think she deserves to be in. Anyway, very happy about that. And then here's a poem that just lit a little flame of joy on my desk when it first arrived there years ago from Guadalajara, Mexico. I was doing an anthology, I think you have the copy there, called The Tree is Older Than You Are, Mexican Poems and Paintings by contemporary Mexican poets. I was a little worried about doing this book, living in South Texas, since I'm not a Mexican American, and I thought people might say, who is she to do this book? So in the introduction, I hope I said, something like, if any of you want to do a Palestinian anthology, feel free. I think we should all cross the borders of culture and ethnicity and gender and everything. And anybody should do any anthology of work you love. And I just loved contemporary Mexican poetry, and I couldn't find a bilingual anthology to use in my classes in South Texas. So here this little 7-year-old tucked one of his poems into his mother's entry of poems. The poet pencil, El lápiz poeta. I'll read it. Jesus Carlos Sotomorfin. Just in English, I'll read it. Once upon a time, a pencil wanted to write poetry, but it didn't have a point. One day, a boy put it into the sharpener, and in place of a point, a river appeared. Well, that's the river that we keep believing in at a festival like this, the river of words that carries us away. And then just 2 very little poems from another anthology I made called The Space Between Our Footsteps, Poems and Paintings from the Middle East. And I felt lucky to be allowed to put some paintings in books. You really have to talk your publishers into it, but they let me. So I want to read a poem by a Palestinian poet, very short, and then an Israeli poet. Sharif El Musa wrote, "But I heard the drops." He grew up in a refugee camp with a family of many children, and his father was a farmer. My father had a reservoir of tears. They trickled down unseen, but I heard the drops drip from his voice like drops from a loosened tap. For 30 years, I heard them. And this by Ronnie Somek, a poem of bliss. We are placed on a wedding cake like the 2 dolls, bride and groom. When the knife strikes, we'll try to stay on the same slice. I think you could probably talk to all the poets of the region and not find a single advocate for anything other than peace and cooperation among them. And many literary people, teachers, librarians, poets, writers of all kinds have been working toward more equal justice, more equanimity in the region for many, many years, and they all believe in that statement. Nobody knows the original source of it now, but the quote, peace is far too important to be left to politicians. And I think that writers do a very strong work in regions of conflict toward continuing to try to help people listen to one another, hear one another. So I thought I would read first a little tiny piece of prose and then end with a little piece of prose too. And this is one that, and these are both nonfiction. And this is one it took me more than 30 years to have the punchline. Museum. I was 17. My family had just moved to San Antonio. A local magazine featured an alluring article about a museum called the McNay, an old mansion that had been the home of an eccentric, many times married watercolorist named Marion McNay. She had deeded her home to the community to become a museum upon her death. I asked my friend Sally, who drove a cute little convertible and had moved to Texas a year before we did, if she wanted to go there. Sally said, sure. She was a good friend that way. We had made up a few words in our own language and could dissolve into laughter just by saying them. Our mothers thought we were a bit odd. On a sunny Saturday, we drove over to Broadway. Sally asked, do you have the address of this place? No, I said. Just drive very slowly and I'll recognize it. There was a picture in the magazine. I peered both directions and pointed, saying, there it is, pull in. The parking lot under some palm trees was pretty empty. We entered, excited. The museum was free. Right away, the spirit of the arched doorways, carved window frames, and elegant artwork overtook us. Sally went left, I went right. A group of people seated in some chairs in the lobby stopped talking and stared at us. May I help you? A man said. No, I said. We're fine. I didn't like to talk to people in museums. Tours and docents got on my nerves. What if they talked a long time about a painting you weren't that interested in? I took a deep breath, moved on to another painting. Fireworks over a patio in Mexico, maybe? There weren't very good tags in this museum. In fact, there weren't any. I stood back and gazed. Sally had gone upstairs. The people in the lobby had stopped chatting. They seemed very nosy, keeping their eyes on me with irritating curiosity. What was their problem? I turned down a hallway. The landscape outside burst with bougainvilleas and azaleas pressed up right against the windows. Maybe we should have brought a picnic. Where was the Moorish courtyard? I saw some nice sculptures in another room, a small couch. This would be a great place for reading. Above the couch hung a radiant print by Paul Klee, my favorite artist, blues and pinks merging softly in his own wonderful way. I stepped closer. Suddenly, I became aware of a man from the lobby standing behind me in the doorway. "Where do you think you are?" he asked. I turned sharply. "The McNay Art Museum." He smiled then and shook his head. "Sorry to tell you, the McNay is 3 blocks over on New Braunfels Street. Take a right when you go out of our driveway, then another right." "What is this place?" I asked, confused. He said, "Well, we thought it was our home." My heart jolted. I raced past him to the bottom of the staircase and called out, "Sally, come down immediately, urgent." I remember being tempted to shout something in our private language, but we didn't have a word for this. Sally came to the top of the stairs smiling happily and said, "You have to come up here. There's some really good stuff. And there are old beds, too." "No, Sally, no," I said, as if she were a dog or a baby. "Come down immediately. Speed it up. This is an emergency." She stepped elegantly down the stairs, as if in a museum trance, looking puzzled. I just couldn't tell her out loud in front of those people what we had done. I actually pushed her toward the front door, waving my hand at the people in the chairs, saying, "Sorry, please forgive us. You have a really nice place." Sally stared at me in the parking lot. When I told her, she covered her mouth and doubled over with laughter, shaking. We were still in their yard. I imagined them inside looking out the windows at us. She couldn't believe how long they let us look around without saying anything either. That was really friendly of them. "Get in the car," I said sternly. "This is mortifying." The real McNay was splendid, but we felt a little nervous the whole time we were there. Van Gogh, Picasso, Tamayo. This time, there were tags. This time, we stayed together in case anything else weird happened. We never told anyone. 30 years later, a nice-looking woman approached me in a public place. "Excuse me," she said. "I need to ask a strange question. Did you ever, by any chance, enter a residence long ago thinking it was the McNay Museum?" 30 years later, my cheeks still burned. "Yes, but how do you know? I never told anyone." That was my home. I was the teenager, sitting with my family, talking in the living room. Before you came over, I never realized what a beautiful place I lived in. I never felt lucky before. You thought it was a museum. My feelings changed about my parents after that. They had good taste. I have always wanted to thank you. Well, of course, that was a rare case in which an old mistake can be redeemed. 30 years later, you give up your remorse 30 years later, and suddenly we're hugging, crying, and my husband's saying, "You did what? Who is that? What did you do?" It was a great moment, and I am grateful for her for coming up. I tried to reach Sally to tell her. She writes computer novels, computer mystery novels. I found this out in my public library, but my letter was returned from her publisher, so I've not been able to give her the good news yet. I thought I'd read a couple of old poems. A few of you have very generously asked me to read a couple of older poems, and so I thought I'd read those first, and then I'll read some newer things. And these are from a book called Words Under the Words, which has my Palestinian grandmother on the cover. She did live, Siti Hadra was her name. She lived to be 106 years old, and she used to say she didn't want to die till everyone she didn't like died first. But she seemed to like everyone, so no one could ever figure out who were those people she was referring to. And she said that the reason for her long life was she never wore socks, and she always ate yogurt for breakfast. That was her very profound strategy. So here's an old poem that was written. I never felt like it was written, though. I felt like it was transmitted. Long ago, my husband and I were on our honeymoon, and we were in the country of Colombia, outside of a beautiful old town called Popayan, and we were on a bus at night. Bad mistake. And we were robbed of everything we had, and including identification, tickets, everything. So it was quite traumatic to be, without any identification in a country in which we had not one friend. And but we didn't suffer the worst fates of that night. And the next, a few days later, we were just kind of still stumbling around trying to figure out what to do. A man came up to us on a street and said simply in Spanish, what happened to you? And he was kind. His demeanor was kind. He didn't give us any money. He didn't take us home with him. He didn't really help us out, but he listened to us. And I felt as if I had learned the meaning of the word kindness for the first time. So I wrote this poem down and didn't feel that I wrote it. I felt like it came through me somehow to save me in that hard time. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, this must go, so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness, how you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you. He too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak to it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend. And this is a poem that I really don't recall the specific occasion for writing it. It came out of a whole season, kind of a mood, a tone of a season. A couple of you mentioned that you knew this was the poem Bill Moyers carries in his wallet, and that really meant a lot to me when he showed me that, all folded up tiny in his wallet. The Art of Disappearing. When they say, "Don't I know you?" say, "No." When they invite you to the party, remember what parties are like before answering. Someone telling you in a loud voice, they once wrote a poem, greasy sausage balls on a paper plate. Then reply. If they say, "We should get together," say, "Why?" It's not that you don't love them anymore. You're trying to remember something too important to forget. Trees, the monastery bell at twilight. Tell them you have a new project. It will never be finished. When someone recognizes you in a grocery store, nod briefly and become a cabbage. When someone you haven't seen in 10 years appears at the door, don't start singing him all your new songs. You will never catch up. Walk around feeling like a leaf. Know you could tumble any second. Then decide what to do with your time. And one other one from this older book. And this is a strange poem because when I wrote it, my mom, who's in the poem, said she didn't remember the incident, but I knew that this was literally correct. This was the exact phrase she had said because I'd carried it so vividly in my mind since I was 7 years old. And then actually her own memory bank started kind of feeding her more scenes, and she started remembering all the days around this scene where it was like just this one little nugget of a poem gave her a whole set of memories back. And then I'm going to read you one of the more interesting letters I've ever received about a poem in response to this poem. Making a Fist. For the first time on the road north of Tampico, I felt the life sliding out of me, a drum in the desert, harder and harder to hear. I was 7. I lay in the car watching palm trees swirl a sickening pattern past the glass. My stomach was a melon split wide inside my skin. How do you know if you're going to die? I begged my mother. We had been traveling for days. With strange confidence, she answered, when you can no longer make a fist. Years later, I smile to think of that journey, the borders we must cross separately, stamped with our unanswerable woes. I, who did not die, who am still living, still lying in the back seat behind all my questions, clenching and opening one small hand. So here's a letter from Vincent Cronin. Ever met him? Dear friend, I have a story to tell you. On June 16th, my heart and lungs stopped working. Fortunately, the local emergency squad arrived quickly, and I was taken to a nearby hospital for more treatment. Once the doctors had done some initial work, they removed the sedative, but I didn't wake up. They told my wife they weren't sure why I wasn't awake, but they would wait 48 hours before doing anything more. They told my wife they didn't think I would recover. My wife was getting ready to leave for the day when I was able to do something she could recognize. While unconscious, but hearing, I clenched my fist, then relaxed it, then clenched it again. My wife has had your poem about the fist on our refrigerator for years. It gave her the signal she needed to force the doctors to continue working on me right then. 46.5 hours later, I woke to full consciousness. I have fully recuperated. Thanks to your poem for giving me a way to say what I meant, a way that helped my wife know I would be all right. Whoa. Well, Nina Cassian, a Romanian poet whom I love, has said, I want poems to be useful. I want them to be like can openers or like little paring knives. I want them to help us in times of need. And when Vincent Cronin was so kind to track me down and tell me about the poem on his refrigerator and the way that it gave him the signal, I just thought that was great. I thought, well, poems can do things we could never have imagined. So there's that. Now here are a few more recent poems. These are from You and Yours. This started out as a very long rant in my journal, kind of thing I would continue writing about, one day, another week, and it never seemed to be going anywhere. I never seemed to solve the question. I still haven't solved the question. I still don't really know the answer to the question. But on the day it came to me that I could just write it as a question, that could be the strategy for the poem, somehow I was released of the burden of writing about this topic anymore. But here it is, and if any of you know the answer to it, please tell me later or now. The day. I missed the day on which it was said, others should not have certain weapons, but we could. Not only could, but should and do. I missed that day. Was I sleeping? I might have been digging in the yard, doing something small and slow as usual. Or maybe I wasn't born yet. What about all the other people who aren't born? Who will tell them? Sometimes a poem can just be a kind of a relief for something burdensome on the mind. And here's another one that I wrote. Too many times when we hear about casualties of citizens of other places, their names are not given. We just get a head count, or sometimes we do get a little story about them. And this was on a day when the name was given and the age of the boy. And as the daughter of a Palestinian, I am very committed and hopeful always for days of greater justice for the Palestinian people and days of more harmony. And I know how many Palestinians have never committed any act of violence, although they have all suffered from acts of violence committed in their, quote, names. And I know how many Israelis long to see more justice for Palestinians. So there's this little bit troubled feeling often reading, say, American newspapers. Yesterday I was reading about Pat Robertson and Rudy Giuliani and how they had bonded on the way home from a trip to Israel and what they were saying. And I think, there are so many parts of the story. This is not just because my father was a Palestinian, but because I've lived there, I've seen it all in action, and because my father was a journalist. So many parts of so many stories that we don't really hear in a balanced way. And we need to remind ourselves of that. And sometimes the quotes we hear about people in other places are incredibly arrogant, and all we have to do is to just do a little quick inverse and imagine, like, if that was people in Mexico saying that about us, or people in Canada saying that about us, how would we feel? Just those little inversions that help you think about the twists of language. Anyway, so my father taught us always to ask questions about the news and the language used in news, and phrases that are troubling, like collateral damage for human beings and things like that. For Mohammed Zaid of Gaza, age 15, there is no stray bullet, sirs. No bullet like a worried cat crouching under a bush. No half-hairless puppy bullet dodging midnight streets. The bullet could not be a pecan plunking tin roof, not hardly. No fluff of pollen on October's breath. No humble pebble at our feet. So don't gentle it, please. We live among stray thoughts, tasks abandoned midstream. Our fickle hearts are fat with stray devotions. We feel at home among bits and pieces, all the wandering ways of words. But this bullet had no innocence, did not wish anyone well. You can't tell us otherwise by naming it mildly. This bullet was never the friend of life, should not be granted immunity by soft saying. Friendly fire, straying death eye. Why have we given the wrong weight to what we do? Muhammad deserves the truth. This bullet had no secret happy hopes. It was not singing to itself with eyes closed under the bridge. And here are a couple from 19 Varieties. Those of you, I know there are a number of people in this room who are from the Middle East or have spent significant time in the Middle East, and so you know, as well as I do, that hospitality and generosity has always been the calling card of the Middle East, and so it's very sad when only violent and negative, ugly headlines are traveling back and forth. So thinking back to a story our dad used to tell us, and sometimes we actually try to hold him to this behavior as well. Red brocade, and brocade is a rich kind of beautiful cloth, you would know with your cloth love. The Arabs used to say, when a stranger appears at your door, feed him for 3 days before asking who he is, where he's come from, where he's headed. That way, he'll have strength enough to answer. Or, by then, you'll be such good friends, you don't care. Let's go back to that. Rice, pine nuts. Here, take the red brocade pillow. My child will serve water to your horse. No, I was not busy when you came. I was not preparing to be busy. That's the armor everyone put on to pretend they had a purpose in the world. I refuse to be claimed. Your plate is waiting. We will snip fresh mint into your tea. The concept of being busy also is peculiarly American, and a lot of people ask questions about it in other countries these days. Like, I was just watching the sad news from Pakistan before I came over here. In Pakistan, for example, no one would ever say they're too busy to meet with you if you showed up at their house or their office door, or in the Middle East, no one would ever say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't get together, I'm busy, I have things going on. In France last year, some French students asked me, is it true that in the United States, high school and college students are too busy to eat pie and drink tea in the afternoons? I said, whoa, what a question, eat pie? I don't know, you'd have to ask them. And I said, do you all go home and eat pie and drink tea? They said, yes. we have to slow down. We have to take a big slow down break. You know, kind of like a siesta in Mexico. We have to slow down. So, but I loved how eating pie was the standard of kind of patient living. Let's hear it for pie. Now, here's one that has a quote from a great Swedish poet whose work I love, Tommy Olofsson, who said in one of his poems, "Let's be the same wound if we must bleed. Let's fight side by side, even if the enemy is ourselves. I am yours, you are mine." I really liked translating that quote over to the idea of Jerusalem, and I asked his permission, and he said, fine, I've never been there, but I can see that it would work for there. And definitely, my father always told us that he believed there could come a day again, like the day days he remembered when he was a child, really happy days in Jerusalem when he said all people lived as if they were cousins, not enemies, and there wasn't a kind of overbearing sense of power going any particular direction, and there weren't as many weapons around. So this poem is called Jerusalem, and this is a rare poem for me in which I actually had the last line of the poem many years before I had the poem. I don't know, Terrence, has that happened to you sometimes? I mean, I don't think it ever happened for me before, but I just had this line sitting all by itself for years, and I would keep looking at it when I would pass through notebooks. Anyway, Jerusalem. I'm not interested in who suffered the most. I'm interested in people getting over it. Once, when my father was a boy, a stone hit him on the head. Hair would never grow there. Our fingers found the tender spot and its riddle. The boy who has fallen stands up. A bucket of pears in his mother's doorway welcomes him home. The pears are not crying. Later, his friend who threw the stone says he was aiming at a bird, and my father starts growing wings. Each carries a tender spot, something our lives forgot to give us. A man builds a house and says, I am native now. A woman speaks to a tree in place of her son, and olives come. A child's poem says, I don't like wars, they end up with monuments. He's painting a bird with wings wide enough to cover 2 roofs at once. Why are we so monumentally slow? Soldiers stalk a pharmacy. Big guns, little pills. If you tilt your head just slightly, it's ridiculous. There's a place in this brain where hate won't grow. I touch its riddle, wind and seeds. Something pokes us as we sleep. It's late, but everything comes next. That was an actual child's poem in the amazing village. If you haven't heard of this village, look it up on the internet. A village called Neve Shalom, or Wahat El Salam, which is really a model village that was originally kind of the idea for it founded by a Christian brother. The idea that if a village had exactly the same number of Jewish families and Arab families, and they kept the power on an absolutely equal basis, like at the school, for example, if the principal of the school is Arab for a while, then the vice principal has to be Jewish. Or if you have this many Arab teachers, you have to have this many Jewish teachers. Like everything just exactly balanced, that maybe things would work out. And nobody's house would be like dramatically better than anyone else's house, and nobody would have any more restrictions placed on them than anyone else. And it's an incredible village. And when you go to the school there, I went there with my dad and my son. We were all very moved by this place. All the kids in the school are learning all their lessons trilingually in Hebrew, Arabic, and English. And that was an actual quote from a poem a child was writing the day I visited. And I wish that village would just be used as a model for so much, for everything we need. Please describe how you became a writer. Possibly I began writing as a refuge from our insulting first grade textbook. Come, Jane, come. Look, Dick, look. Were there ever duller people in the world? You had to tell them to look at things? Why weren't they looking to begin with? And so this This is the first literary festival. Someone asked me about this today. I've never read this out loud. The first literary festival I ever attended in my life, I was in my 20s. It was at Notre Dame University. And the only reason I was invited was one of my best friends, somebody 6 years younger than I was the organizer of it at Notre Dame. So he invited me and kind of gave me some jobs, like to just help out, do all these chores. And Tennessee Williams decided that I was his personal maid for the entire conference. And so it was a very unique position to be in, just because I had picked him up at the airport. Pimento, tell them Mr. Tennessee Williams has signed his last autograph, he said, sighing richly, lolling back in an overstuffed chair, asking for olives. Did I look like a bodyguard? At age 24, thunderstruck by proximities, I would stand between him and his readers. Against the luscious green brocade, he flexed his shoulders, closed his eyes, balanced a green olive with a dash of red on his lower lip, popped it in. A woman with a book dashed forward. Mr. Tennessee Williams has signed his last autograph, I said, raising my elbow. She looked horrified. Her friends lifted dainty glasses of wine near a lamp with a stained shade. William Stafford held a paper plate carefully, tiny diamonds of crackers and cheese. He liked them. He would sign anything. And here was Ken Kesey, wearing a fuzzy orange poncho, saying I would be a better singer if I sang more like Bob Dylan. Well, who wouldn't be? William Burroughs urged me to up my intake of vitamin C. It's absolutely true. All right. And I will read frequent flyers, since you mentioned that one from this book, and then just a couple of other things. This is also written as a little nonfiction prose poem thing. I realized that I traveled too much on the day I began tidying an airport as if it were my bedroom. Unconsciously, I picked up subscription cards that had slipped from magazines, loose newspaper sections, empty soda cups, and pitched them into the trash. Hey, it was my gate. I wanted it to look nice. The prim decisiveness of airports feels deeply pleasing and restful. The anonymity, a gust of fresh air. Neat signage, changing gate information, moving sidewalks, minimalist trains arriving in 2 minutes. Delicious. Why do so many people complain about airports? How hard is it to show one's ID? A few weeks ago, I was at LaGuardia long enough to start a small business. I know Houston's Hobby and Washington's National as well as the blocks around our house. I love Chicago's Neon Tunnel and the Tom's toothpaste display in Portland, Maine. Portland's airport, however, does not sell Tom's toothpaste. In San Antonio, we display Mexican tile sinks. You could rally some Tom's toothpaste and brush your teeth over them. I like putting things together, imagining lives. Where are all these people going? So many children traveling alone. I know which stalls nationwide serve the best sesame bagel. I am such a frequent flyer, I could become a flight attendant tomorrow with no training. Perhaps this is insulting to the profession. Surely attendants do many crucial things we never see. But I find myself mouthing their safety instructions perfectly. And sometimes, after serving drinks at my own home, I walk around with a trash bag and a grim smile. It is true that on all sides, at every gate, frantic women and men are punching numbers into little phones. Soon they will be condemned to live 2 whole hours without calling anyone. This is hard for them. It makes no difference whether I'm headed to Seattle, Winnipeg, Toronto, Boise. Airport is the hopeful second home place, the precious en route, the hour you could be anyone who ever passed through. Maybe I was marked. My dad used to take us to our house in St. Louis was very near the St. Louis airport, and planes flew over our neighborhood, and he used to take us over there, just on dull evenings to kind of see who was coming and going. And in those days, of course, without any security, you could just walk to every gate and go everywhere and, feel like you were coming and going. And so maybe that kind of marked my affection for those places. I wanted to read just a couple from Amaze Me. Now, one thing I loved today when Becky Flanagan was talking about eavesdropping and all the things we put in our notebooks, and Becky and Ken were talking about, just this many, many sources of sweet inspiration for poems. And I've always taped quotations from newspapers. I'm going to tape that one about the cat on this campus saying help into my notebook. And then just see what they grow into later, because, if you don't, you'll forget it, and there's really great ones. Has anyone in here, by the way, seen, I haven't mentioned this, but I just noticed today that it's in my notebook, and I just think it's one of the most phenomenal newspaper stories that I didn't hear anyone talk about. It was in the Washington Post in the summer, and it was about the family who was outside eating on their patio when an armed intruder jumped into the patio. Do you remember this story? And quick work. Instead of, panicking, calling the police, fighting with him, wrestling him to the ground, they said, "Hey man, would you like some cheese? You want some crackers? Would you like some wine?" And they invited him to the table. And by the time, I don't know how many minutes passed, he had hugged all of them, apologized, said he had the wrong house, and left. Unbelievable story. But it did remind me, speaking, we've talked about a few issues of issues, with racism and our childhoods, and things have come up here. A few years ago, I was asked by a poet I love very much, who's Chinese American, how my father dealt with racism back in the 50s when he came to the United States. And I was kind of dumbfounded, and I said, well, I really don't think he experienced any. And my friend said, "Oh, come on, he must have, because I've met him. He has an accent. He looks, different, and I'm sure he looked more different then, before his hair was white. And so, what did he do?" And I said, "Well, what my dad always did was he greeted everyone as my friend. And we went in any restaurant or any bus or any place, he would just say, 'My friend, you look like the person who could help me. My friend, this or that.'" And I think about that often in a complicated world. How many troubled situations like those people did in D.C. Just saying, "Hey, buddy, sit down and, sit down with us." Well, okay, so this poem called Feeling Wise has two random quotes that had been in my notebook, stuck in from different newspapers. A lady was quoted in a newspaper. Oh, by the way, this is a book of poems for 12-year-old girls. I hope you won't feel insulted. A lady was quoted in the newspaper. "It is not so hard to feel wise. Just think of something dumb you could say, then don't say it." I like her. I would take her gingerbread if I knew where her house was. Julia Child, the famous chef, said, "I never feel lonely in the kitchen. Food is very friendly. Just looking at a potato, I like to pat it. Staring down, you feel tall. Staring into someone else's eyes, you're not alone. Staring out the window during school, you become the future, smooth and large." And this is, "Sometimes I pretend I'm not me. I only work for me. This feels like a secret motor churring inside my pocket. I think she will be so glad when she sees the homework neatly written. She will be relieved someone sharpened pencils, folded clothes." Toby was talking yesterday about just that detachment that writing can sometimes give us, an ability to kind of stand back out of a scene and look at it and imagine what it might look like later. And I think of that one in that way. And just a couple other quick ones here. How do I know when a poem is finished? Common question to poets. When you quietly close the door to a room, the room is not finished. It is resting, temporarily, glad to be without you for a while. Now it has time to gather its balls of gray dust, to pitch them from corner to corner. Now it seeps back into itself, unruffled and proud. Outlines grow firmer. When you return, you might move the stack of books, freshen the water for the roses. I think you could keep doing this forever. But the blue chair looks best with the red pillow, so you might as well leave it that way. And this is for a girl. I'll probably never meet. But my niece graduated from college in Australia last Christmas time, and she came to stay with us for 2 weeks at Christmas. And she said that everybody in her university was given the same assignment, no matter what your major was, for your last semester. You had to read the blog of an Iraqi citizen and then write a paper about it. And you had to read it over the semester, not just once. You had to keep going back to it. And then write a paper in any way you wanted. It could be a creative paper, a creative response to the person. It could be an analytical paper, and people did it in all sorts of ways. But she told me that she had been reading a girl named Sunshine. Does anyone here read her? She's 15 now. She was 14 when my niece was reading her. I urge you to look up her blog. She's an amazing young woman. You can just find it by looking up Sunshine Blog Iraq, and it'll come up. So I started reading her last Christmas after my niece left, and was very moved, very, very moved by what she writes. And some days, she loves school. She writes a lot about school and her teachers and her tests and her homework assignments and the books she reads, and her friends, her concerns. It's not primarily a political blog, but she's living in Iraq, so things sneak in. And a lot of her classmates have had things happen in their families, and she's very nervous a lot of the time. And some days her entries will be as slim as, better not write anything today since I'm an optimist. But anyway, just a few weeks ago, I started reading. I realized I've always been so absorbed in her blog and reading the archive of her blog, like all the days I miss, that I had never read the other blogs that she recommends on her blog, and one of them is her mother's. Oh my goodness. So if you read hers for a while and then you read her mother's, it will really be amazing, because her mother is having a hard time being an optimist and is a dentist, and just an incredible insight into what's going on. She also gives you like little clues about her daughter, little factual things that you haven't picked up from Sunshine's own blog. Anyway, I think about her all the time, so this is a poem for her. Someone you will not meet rolls her socks into balls, lines them in a shoebox, sharpens a yellow pencil, carefully checking the point. There used to be plenty of pencils. Stares into a mirror thinking, fat nose, pins a green bow to her head, plucks it off again, worries about loud noises, wraps presents in the same crumpled paper over and over again for members of her own family. Gives her brother an orange because he likes them more than she does. He complains, I am sick of this life. She fusses at him, don't say that. Gives her mother a handwritten booklet made of folded papers called One Apartment. The people she loves most are in it. The uncles who come and go are in it. Lucky ducks. They are afraid every time they go, but they brave it. A few cats and plants and rugs are in it. Square television set with a scrappy picture, streams of bees swooping to the jasmine vine right outside the window. They dip into blossoms and fly away. Never could she have imagined being jealous of a bee. She listens to the radio say there will be more fighting, though no one she knows likes fighting. Does anyone feel happy after fighting? It's a mystery. She chews on a sesame cookie, very, very slowly. Staring at the sesame seeds, she could almost give them names. It's interesting to see what little colloquialisms she adopts, things like lucky ducks, and you wonder where she's heard these little kind of Americanized phrases, but read her. I think you'll like her. And so I just wanted to read these two other little prose things now and close and see if anyone has anything you want to talk about. Just have to read this. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs from I'll Ask You 3 Times, Are You Okay? My newest book, Tales of Driving and Being Driven. When I see the rules in taxi cabs, or the little black and white mugshots of drivers on visors with their names attached and the dates of their licensing, something lights up. When I hear the taxi radios tuned to a certain station, and it is never the station I would have listened to myself, never once, I feel a shimmering sense of the wider world. It's right there, so close, but it may remain as secretly contained as the engine of the car, the valves and belts, unless you are lucky. A taxi driver in Dallas says 10 people control the universe. They are the ones in charge of the plastic, the credit cards, behind the scenes, under the tables. Trust me, he says. I ask a driver in North Carolina about his favorite places. He says, I have never been out of North Carolina in my life. Nope, that's wrong. I've been to the beach of South Carolina. But it doesn't really count as a different state, in my opinion, because it's still a Carolina. Basically, I think the Carolinas are all I'm ever going to need. So you see why I had to read that. So that's why I was really interested in your answer last night. That was fascinating. Okay, and here's one. Now, when we talked about nonfiction today and kind of going back and getting things wrong, I called this when I wrote it Gate 4A, but when I was back in the Albuquerque airport a few months later, I looked again, and the gates there are A4. So I've inverted it, but I'm reading it from the earlier version, so 4A. Anyway, thank you so much for listening, and I will see if anybody has any questions or answers, and close with a little song too. So thanks. Gate 4A. Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal, after learning my flight had been detained 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate 4A understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate 4A was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing loudly. Help, said the flight service person. Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this. I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke to her haltingly. Shu dawa, shu biddak, habibti. Sten shway, min fadlik. Shu bitsawi. The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, you're fine, you'll get there. Who's picking you up? Let's call him. We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane and would ride next to her, Southwest. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons, just for fun. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course, they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up about 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling about her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar, crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, out of her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo, we were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There is no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free beverages from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving us all apples covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country traveling tradition. Always carry a plant, always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person in this gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're a very, very kind and sweet audience. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for being here. Anybody have anything you want to talk about, ask about, sing about?